Section 4 of Ancient Civilizations of Mexico and Central America by Herbert J. Spinden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mario Pineda. Chapter 2 The Maya Civilization, Part 1. The wonderful culture of the Mayan Indians, to which we will now turn our attention, was developed in the humid lowlands of Central America and especially in the Yucatan Peninsula. Artists are everywhere of the opinion that the sculptures and other products of the Mayas deserve to rank among the highest art products of the world, and astronomers are amazed at the progress made by these people in the measuring of time by the observed movements of the heavenly bodies. Moreover, they invented a remarkable system of hieroglyphic writing by which they were able to record facts and events, and they built great cities of stone that attest a degree of wealth and splendor beyond anything seen elsewhere in the New World. The Mayan culture was made possible by the agricultural conquest of the rich lowlands, where the exuberance of nature can only be held in check by organized effort. On the highlands, the preparation of the land is comparatively easy, owing to scanty natural vegetation and a control vested in irrigation. On the lowlands, however, great trees have to be felled and fast-growing bushes kept down by untiring energy. But when nature is truly tamed, she returns recompense many-fold to the daring farmer. Moreover, there is reason to believe that the removal of the forest cover over large areas affects favorably the conditions of life, which under a canopy of leaves are hard indeed. The principal crops of the Mayas were probably much the same as on the highlands, with maize as the great staple. Varieties favorable to a humid environment had doubtless been developed from the highland stock by selective breeding as agriculture worked its way down into the lowlands. Archaic art appears along the edges of the Mayan area in the state of Veracruz, Mexico, and in the Ulloa Valley, Honduras. In both these regions are also found clay figurines that mark the transition in style between the archaic and the Mayan, as well as finished examples of the latter. There can be no doubt, then, that the archaic art of Mexico marks an earlier horizon than the Mayan. Whether or not it was once laid entirely across the Mayan area cannot be decided on present data, but it seems unlikely. We have already seen that this first art was distributed primarily across arid and open territory. With their calendarial system already in working order, the Mayas appear on the threshold of history 600 years before the Christian era, according to a correlation with European chronology that will be explained later. The first great cities were Tikal in northern Guatemala and Copan in western Honduras, both of which had a long and glorious existence. Many others sprang into prominence at a somewhat later date, for example, Palenque, Yaxchilan or Menche, Piedras Negras, Ceibal, Naranjo, and Quiriguá. The most brilliant period was from 300 to 600 AD, after which all these cities appear to have been abandoned to the forest that soon closed over them. The population moved to northern Yucatan, where it no longer reacted strongly upon the other nations of Central America, and where it enjoyed a second period of brilliancy several hundred years later. Architecture. The idea of a civic center is admirably illustrated in Maya cities, particularly those of the first brilliant period. The principal structures are built across courts or plazas, and there is usually an artificial acropolis, which is a great terraced mound serving as a common base or platform from which the individual pyramidal bases of several temples rise. At some sites this acropolis is a natural hill which has been trimmed down or added to, but at other sites it is entirely artificial. At Copan there is an especially fine example of artificial platform mound rising from one end of the great plaza and affording space for several temples, as well as for sunken courts with stepped sides that may have been theaters. The river washing against one side of this great mound has removed perhaps a third of it and made a vertical section that shows the method of construction. It is apparent that the mound was enlarged and all walls and floors buried. Mayan buildings are of two principal kinds. One is a temple pure and simple, and the other has been called a palace. The temple is a rectangular structure crowning a rather high pyramid that rises in several steps or terraces. As a rule, the temple has a single front with one or more doorways and is approached by a broad stairway. The pyramid is ordinarily a solid mass of rubble and earth faced with cement or cut stone and rarely contains compartments. Some temples have but a single chamber, while others have two or more chambers, the central or innermost one being especially developed into a sanctuary. The so-called palaces are clusters of rooms on low and often irregular platforms. These palaces might have been habitations of the priests and nobility. The common people doubtless lived in palm-thatched huts similar to those used today in the same region. The typical Mayan construction is effaced concrete. The limestone, which abounds in nearly all parts of the Mayan area, was burned into lime. This was then slaked to make mortar and applied to a mass of broken limestone. The facing stones were smoothed on the outside and left rough-hewn and pointed on the inside. It is likely that these facing stones were held in place between forms and the lime, mortar, and rubble filled in between. The resulting wall was essentially monolithic. The rooms of Mayan buildings are characteristically vaulted, but the roof is not a true arch with a keystone. The vault, like the walls, is a solid mass of concrete that grips the cut stone veneer and that must have been held in place by a false work form while it was hardening. The so-called corbelled arch of overstepping stones was doubtless known to the Mayan builders but was little used. Taking the single rectangular room as the unit of construction, the width was limited to the span of the vault, which seldom exceeded 12 feet, while the length was indeterminate. The first variation from the temple with one rectangular room was the two-roomed structure with one chamber directly behind the other. In this case, there were two vaulted compartments separated from each other by a common supporting wall pierced by one or more doorways. The inner room was naturally more dimly lighted than the other one, and as a result was modified into a sanctuary or holy of holies, enhanced by sculptures and paintings, while the outer room developed gradually into a portico. The outer wall was cut by doorways till only pier-like sections remained, and finally these piers were replaced by square or round columns. The development of the Mayan temple may be traced through 1,000 years of change and adjustment. Much attention was paid by Mayan builders to the question of stability, which was accomplished directly by keeping the center of gravity of the principal masses within the supporting walls rather than by the use of binding stones. The cross-section of a two-room temple of late date will illustrate how this was done. There are three principal masses, one over the front wall, one over the medial partition, and one over the back wall. The roof where these sections join is of no great thickness. The central mass is symmetrical and, if the mortar has the proper cohesiveness, very stable. For the front and back masses, the projection of the upper or free zone tends to counterbalance the overhang of half the vault. In the earlier temples, the upper zone of the facade often slopes backward so that the balance is not so perfect. So far, we have given brief space to the question of elevations. Taken vertically, there are three parts to the Mayan building. First, the substructure or pyramidal base. Second, the structure proper. Third, the superstructure. In the case of temples, the structure proper is 1 story in height. 2 and 3 stories are rather common in palaces, but the upper stories are in most cases built directly over a solid core and not over the rooms of the lower story. The upper stories, therefore, recede so that the building presents a terraced or pyramidal profile. One building at Tikal is 5 stories in height, in 3 receding planes, the 3 uppermost stories being one above the other. In a tower at Palenque we have an example of 4 stories, but this is unusual. On top of the building proper, especially if it is a temple, we frequently find a superstructure. This is a sort of crest or roof wall, usually pierced by windows. When this wall rises from the center line of the roof, it is called a roof comb or roof crest, and when it rises from the front wall, it is called a flying facade. The highest temples in the Mayan area are those of Tikal that attain a total height of about 175 feet, counting pyramid and superstructure. Massive sculptural art. The decoration of Mayan buildings may be considered under three heads. First, interior decoration. Second, facade decoration. Third, supplementary monuments. In many temples at Yaxchilan, Tikal, etc., are found splendidly sculptured lintels of stone or wood. At Copan we see wall sculptures that adorn the entrance to the sanctuary, and at Palenque finely sculptured tablets let into the rear wall of the sanctuary. Elsewhere are occasional examples of mural paintings, sculptured door jambs, decorated interior steps, etc. The facade decorations of the earlier Mayan structures are freer and more realistic than those of the later buildings. In many cases they consist of figures of men, serpents, etc., modeled in stucco or built up out of several nicely fitted blocks of stone. Grotesque faces also occur. In the later styles, decoration consists largely of masked panels, which are grotesque from view faces arranged to fill rectangular panels, but there is an increasing amount of purely geometric ornament. The masked panels represent in most instances a highly elaborated serpent's face, which sometimes carry the special markings of one of the greater gods. These panels, considered historically, pass through some interesting developments. Angular representations of serpent heads in profile are sometimes used at the sides of doorways. The supplementary monuments are stelae and altars. These are monolithic sculptures that are often set up in definite relation to a building either on the terraces or at the foot of the stairway. The stelae are great plinths or slabs of stone carved on one or more sides with the figures of priests and warriors loaded down with religious symbols. The altars are small stones usually placed in front of the stelae. Many stelae and altars are set up in plazas and have no definite architectural quality. Minor arts. While the richly ornamented temples and the great monoliths attract first attention as works of art, the humbler products of the potter, the weaver, and the lapidary also attained to grace and dignity. The Mayas were expert potters and employed a variety of technical processes in the decoration of their wares, such as painting, modeling, engraving, and stamping. We can only take time to examine a few examples of the best works, leaving the commoner products practically undescribed. Suffice it to say that tripod dishes were much used, as well as bowls, bottle-necked vessels, and cylindrical vases, and that the common decorative use of hieroglyphics serves to mark off Mayan pottery from that of other Central American peoples. The realistic designs are drawn in accordance with the highest principles of decorative art. Serpents, monkeys, jaguars, various birds, as well as priests and supernatural beings, are used as subjects for the pottery embellishment. Geometric decoration is also much used. The polychrome pottery is rare and exceptionally beautiful, with designs related to religious subjects. The background color of these cylindrical vases is usually orange or yellow, the designs are outlined in black, and the details filled in with delicate washes of red, brown, white, etc. The surface bears a high polish made by rubbing. Plate 18 reproduces the design units on two vases from Chama, Guatemala. The first example pictures a seated man with a white spreading headdress made of two conventional serpent heads, from the ends of which issue the plumes of the quetzal. The hieroglyphs are Mayan day signs, Ben and Imix on the left, and Kan and Kaban on the right. The second example presents a god before an altar. This god has the face of an old man, and his body is attached to a spiral shell. This divinity was probably associated with the end of the year. In the next illustration, an engraved design on a bowl from northern Yucatan is given. A jaguar attired in the dress of man is seated in a wreath of water lilies. After the vessel had been formed, but before it had been fired, this design was made by cutting away the background and incising finer details on the original surfaces. Other designs in relief were obtained by direct modeling or by stamping. The stamps were molds or negatives made from bas-relief patterns. The textile arts of the ancient Mayas can be recovered in part from a study of the monuments, since the designs of many garments are reproduced in delicate relief. The designs are mostly all over geometric patterns, but borders reproducing the typical celestial band, a line of astronomical symbols, are also seen. The techniques of brocade and lace were understood by the ancient weavers. In the minor textile art of basketry, the products must also have ranked high. A typical basket pictured on a lintel is given in Figure 25. Jade and other semi-precious stones were carved by the Mayas into beautiful and fantastic shapes. There was a considerable use of mosaic veneer on masks and other ceremonial objects. Metal was unknown during the first centuries of Mayan fluorescence. Later it was rare and could not be used for tools, but the working of gold and copper in the manufacture of ornaments was on a high plane. Having now passed in brief review the objective side of Mayan remains, let us turn our attention to the subjective. The serpent in Mayan art. Mayan art is strange and unintelligible at first sight, but after careful study, many wonderful qualities appear in it. In the knowledge of foreshortening and composition, the Mayas were superior to the Egyptians and Assyrians. They could draw the human body in pure profile and in free and graceful attitudes, and they could compose several figures in a rectangular panel so that the result satisfies the eye of a modern artist. But unfortunately for our fuller understanding, the human form had only a minor interest because the gods were not in the image of man and the art was essentially religious. The gods were at best half human and half animal, with grotesque elaborations. The high aesthetic qualities were therefore wasted on subjects that appear trivial to many of us. But as we break away more and more from the shackles of our own artistic conventions, we shall be able to appreciate the many beauties of ancient American sculpture. The serpent motive controlled the character of Mayan art and was of first importance in all subsequent arts in Central America and Mexico. The serpent was seldom represented realistically, and yet we may safely infer that the rattlesnake was the prevailing model. Parts of other creatures were added to the serpent's body, such as the plumes of the trogon or quetzal, the teeth of the jaguar, and the ornaments of man. The serpent was idealized, and the lines characteristic of it entered into the delineation of many subjects distinct from the serpent itself. Scrolls and other sinuous details were attached to the serpent's body, and human ornaments such as earplugs, nose plugs, and even headdresses were added to its head. Finally, a human head was placed in the distended jaws. The Mayas might have intended to express the essential human intelligence of the serpent in this fashion. The serpent, with the human head in its mouth, doubtless belongs in the same category as the partly humanized gods of Egypt, Assyria, and India. It illustrates the partial assumption of human form by a beast divinity. The features combined are so peculiar and unnatural that the influence of Mayan art can be traced far and wide through Central America and Mexico by comparative study of the serpent motive. A typical serpent head in profile, with the human head omitted, as developed by the Mayas for decorative purposes, is reproduced in Figure 27 with the parts lettered and named. It will be noted that the lines of interest in this design are either vertical or horizontal, although the parts themselves have sinuous outlines. Two features of the typical serpent's body enter widely into the enrichment of all kinds of subjects. One of these is the double outline, which is derived from the line paralleling the base of the serpent's body and serving to mark off the belly region. The second feature is the small circle applied in bead-like rows to represent scales. The profile serpent head is also seen in scrolls and frets that elaborate many details of dress worn by the human beings carved on the monuments. The front view of the serpent's head is usually extended to fill an oblong panel and is often used to decorate the base of a monument or the facade of a building. There are several monsters closely connected with the serpent that will be discussed as the description proceeds. The human figure. The human beings pictured on Mayan monuments are captives, rulers, and priests or worshippers. The captives are poor groveling creatures bound by rope, held by the hair, or crushed underfoot to fill a rectangular space over which the conqueror stands. The rulers and priests are hard to distinguish from each other, perhaps because the government was largely theocratic and the ruler was looked upon as the spokesman of divinity. The spear and shield of war served to mark off certain human beings from others who carried religious objects such as the ceremonial bar and the manikin scepter. Elaborate thrones on several monuments are canopied over by the arched body of the two-headed dragon that bears symbols of the planets. Over all is seen the great serpent bird with outstretched wings. Upon the throne is seated the human being, who may safely be called the king, and a line of footprints on the front of the throne may symbolize ascent. On other monuments, the commanding personage wears the mask of a god and wields a club to subdue or scatters grain to placate. On the great majority of monuments, the human beings, richly attired in ceremonial regalia and carrying a variety of objects, possibly present the great warriors and priests of the day. Many of the early sculptures are stiff and formal, but in a number of instances the quality of actual portraiture is convincing. Design, composition, and perspective. It is difficult to compare directly the graphic and plastic arts of different nations where the subject matter is diverse unless we compare them in accordance with absolute principles of design, composition, and perspective drawing. The Mayas produced one of the few really great and coherent expressions of beauty so far given to the world, and their influence in America was historically as important as was that of the Greeks in Europe. Set as we are in the matrix of our own religious and artistic conventions, we find it difficult to approach sympathetically beauty that is overcast with an incomprehensible religion. When we can bring ourselves to feel the serpent symbolism of the Mayan artists, as we feel, for instance, the conventional halo that crowns the ideal head of Christ, then we shall be able to recognize the truly emotional qualities of Mayan sculptures. It is generally recognized that design to be successful must contain order of various sorts, in measurements, shapes, directions, tones, colors, etc. In the simpler forms of decorative art, the restrictions of technical process, as in basketry, may impose order, but in freehand sculpture it must come from an educated sense of beauty involving selection and the reproduction of the finest qualities. Design at its highest is embodied in the Mayan hieroglyphs. Given spaces had to be filled with given symbols, and the results attained were uniformly excellent. Although the influence of the serpent led to the great use of tapering flame-like masses in nearly all Mayan designs, still dominant vertical and horizontal lines of interest were maintained. The panel and lintel sculptures show composition achieved by simple and subtle methods. These sweeping plumes of headdresses were skillfully used to fill in corners, while blocks of glyphs were placed in open spaces that might otherwise distract the attention. Many compositions appear overcrowded to us, but this fault decreases with knowledge of the subject matter. Also, the Mayas appear to have painted their sculptures so that the details were emphasized by color contrast. In perspective, as applied to the human figure, the Mayas were far ahead of the Egyptians and Assyrians, since they could draw the body in front view and pure profile without the distortions seen in the Old World. They were even able to make graceful approximations of a three-quarters view, as may be seen in Plate 19, where the raising of the nearer shoulder has a distinct perspective value. The Mayan Pantheon. We have seen that during the earliest culture of Mexico and Central America, there were no figurines of individualized gods, simply straightforward representations of human beings and animals. With the Mayan culture, however, we enter upon an epoch of rich religious symbolism. The serpent, highly conventionalized as we have just seen, and variously combined with elements taken from the quetzal, the jaguar, and even from man himself, appears as a general indication of divinity. The ceremonial bar, essentially a two-headed serpent carrying in its mouth the heads of an important god, is one of the earliest religious objects. The heads that appear in the mouths are usually those of a Roman-nosed or of a long-nosed god. Other representations of divinities are combined with the two-headed dragon that also has reptilian characters. Still, others appear as headdresses and masks on human figures. Strange to say, the gods are supplementary to the human figures on all the early sculptures. In the codices, however, they are represented apart from man, as engaged in various activities and contests. Mayan religion was clearly organized on a dualistic basis. The powers for good are in a constant struggle with the powers for evil, and most of the benevolent divinities have malevolent duplicates. In actual form, the gods are partly human, but ordinarily the determining features are grotesque variations from the human face and figure. While beast associations are sometimes discernible, they are rarely controlling. Sometimes, however, beast gods are represented in unmistakable fashion, good examples being the jaguar, the bat, and the mound bird. All of these have human bodies and animal heads. The head position in the Mayan pantheon may with some assurance be given to a god who has been called the Roman nose god and who is probably to be identified with Itzamna. According to Spanish writers, Itzamna was regarded by the Mayas as the creator and father of all, the inventor of writing, the founder of the Mayan civilization, and the god of light and life. This Zeus of the Mayas is represented in the form of an old man with a high forehead, a strongly aquiline nose, and a distended mouth, toothless or with a single enlarged tooth in front. On the ancient monuments he is frequently seen in the mouths of a ceremonial bar and also in association with the sun, moon, and the planet Venus. In the codices, he is shown as a protector of the maize god and in other acts beneficial to man. There is, however, a malevolent aspect of this god, or possibly another being who imitates his features but not his qualities. This being may be an old woman goddess who wears a serpent headdress and who is associated with destructive floods, the very opposite of life-giving sunshine. Of almost equal importance to a Roman nose god is a god whose face is a more or less humanized serpent. His proper name is Bolon Zakav. On the early monuments, this god is shown in connection with the ceremonial bar. He also appears at a somewhat later date as the mannequin scepter, an object in the form of a mannequin that is held out by a leg modified into a serpent's body. Since a celt is usually worn in the forehead of the mannequin, it has been suggested that this curious object represents a ceremonial battle axe. The face of the long-nosed god is frequently worn by high priests and rulers either as a headdress or, more rarely, as a mask. It is possible that this divinity was regarded as primarily a war god, but in the codices he is evidently a universal deity of varied powers. Especially he is shown in connection with water and maize, and it seems likely that his principal function was to cause life-giving rain. A malevolent variant of the long-nosed god has a bare bone for the lower jaw, a sun symbol on his forehead, and a headdress consisting of 3 other symbols. This head is associated with the two-headed dragon, a monster which brings calamity at times of the inferior conjunction of Venus and the sun. Puch, the lord of death, was the principal malevolent god. His body, as figured in the codices, is a strange compound of skeletal and full-fleshed parts. His head is a skull except for the normal ears. His spinal column is usually bare and sometimes the ribs as well, but the arms and legs are often covered with flesh. As added symbols, black spots and dotted lines are sometimes drawn upon his body and a curious device like a percentage sign upon his cheek. The death god in complete form is rarely shown in the earlier sculptures, although grinning skulls and interlacing buns occur as temple decorations. As has already been pointed out, Mayan religion was strongly dualistic, and the evil powers are usually to be identified by death symbols, such as bare bone for the lower jaw, or the percentage symbol noted above on the cheek. Death heads of several kinds are frequent in the hieroglyphic inscriptions. The maize god, figured so frequently on the ancient monuments and in the Mayan codices, may be the same that in the time of the conquest was called Yumcax, Lord of the Harvest. He is represented as a youth with a leafy headdress that is possibly meant to represent an opening ear of maize. The Can sign, a grain of maize, is constantly associated with them. He appears to be at the mercy of the evil deities when not protected by the good ones. Space considerations forbid the further study of Mayan gods. Suffice it to say that several other divinities are shown in the sculptures and codices, including a somewhat youthful-appearing war god, as well as a more mature and grotesque war god called Ek-Ahau, the Black Captain. There is an old god with a shell attached to his body, a god with the face of a monkey who is associated with the North Star, a god in the form of a frog, and another in the form of a bat. In the Spanish accounts we can also glean scanty information concerning Ixchel, goddess of the rainbow and mate of Itzamna, Ixtumbun, patroness of jade carvers, Ixchebeliax, patroness of the art of weaving and decorating cloth, etc. End of section 4.